I thought that man was a stand-up guy. He's really a monster. Him and his wife. Beaten, and the anger that he showed towards my daughter, I've never seen from him. I would have never sent her there.
Tonight, a mother's agony. A woman who trusted her young daughter's care to her parents is sharing the gut-wrenching moment she learned her girl was dead, allegedly beaten to death by those grandparents.
My baby's face was disfigured.
But here's what matters most. From infancy...
Where's your eyes?
To twirling, young Jada leaves behind a world of great memories.
I loved to dress her up when she was a baby. She was a princess. She was very sweet, always smiling, even in the midst of everything that she endured.
Tell me what you're eating.
I'm eating some cake.
And what kind of cake was it?
It was a balloon cake.
It was a what kind of cake?
A balloon cake.
But what was the cake for?
It was for me.
July 14th, 2023, 10:50 p.m. A 911 dispatcher in Park Forest, Illinois, answers a call that begins with a confession. There is no lead-up, no explanation. Just a man named Clint Elwoods admitting into the receiver, "I was beating my little granddaughter, and now she is out of it." He tells the operator she is limp. She isn't moving. He admits he hit her too hard. When police arrived at 300 Osage Street minutes later, they stepped into a living room that looked normal at first glance. But on the couch lay 5-year-old Jada Moore. She was completely naked and unresponsive. Her body was a medical map of physical trauma. Fresh purple welts sat on top of old, yellowing scars. A 5-year-old girl is dead because of a potty training accident. That is the raw reality of this case. Her life was ended by a grandfather's version of discipline. We are taught from birth that family is the ultimate safety net. We send our children to their grandparents' home because we believe those four walls are a fortress against the world. It's the one place where they should be fed, loved, and protected. But for Jada Moore, the people her mother trusted became her executioners. Have you ever felt that a family member was a stand-up person, only to find out they possessed a capacity for violence you never saw coming? For 4 months, Jada was a ghost in the suburbs. She lived on a quiet street, yet no neighbors ever saw her play. No schools knew her name. She was kept in total domestic isolation, trapped in a house that had become a torture chamber. How did a man with a violent record of robbery and carjacking convince his family he was a stand-up guy, while he was systematically breaking a child? If you are the kind of person who questions the official narrative and wants to understand the why behind the crime, you are in the right place. Join our investigation unit by hitting that subscribe button now. Let's open the file. Jada Moore was a child who lived in a world of vibrant pinks and Barbie dolls. To those who knew her back in Georgia, she was eccentric in the best way possible, a 5-year-old with a sweet, high-energy personality that filled up a room. Digital artifacts left behind by her mother, Kimberly Elwoods, show Jada doing exactly what a child her age should be doing: laughing, eating cake, and playing. She wasn't just a case number. She was a girl who was supposed to start school in Atlanta in August 2023. She had a future mapped out in the Georgia school system, a path that was cut short by a temporary move meant to provide her with more stability, not less. The move from Georgia to Illinois was fueled by economic necessity. Kimberly Elwoods had fallen on hard times and was working to restructure her life. She had secured a new job in Atlanta that required her full focus and financial discipline. During this period of professional transition, Kimberly turned to her father, Clint Elwoods. In her eyes, Clint was a stand-up guy, a reliable family patriarch who could offer Jada a safe, suburban environment in Park Forest while Kimberly got back on her feet. In March 2023, Clint traveled to Georgia, picked up his granddaughter, and drove her back to Illinois. It was a move made out of love and a mother's desire for her child to have the best possible care during a difficult time. However, this arrangement fell into a dangerous category known as informal kinship care. In the United States, when a child enters the foster care system, the state acts as a gatekeeper. Background checks are mandatory. Home inspections are frequent. Social workers are assigned to monitor the child's well-being. But when a parent voluntarily places a child with a relative, the state is often never notified. This creates a regulatory gap. Because Jada's placement was a private family agreement, it didn't trigger any oversight from the Illinois Department of Children and Family Services. No one checked Clint Elwood's criminal history. No one inspected the home on Osage Street. This oversight gap is even wider when children cross state lines. Usually, the interstate compact on the placement of children requires the receiving state to evaluate the home. But because this move was voluntary and informal, Jada effectively disappeared from the system's radar the moment she crossed the Illinois border. She was no longer a student in Georgia, and she wasn't yet a resident of Illinois in any official capacity. She was in a shadow zone, living in a house where the state didn't know she existed, and where the community had no reason to look for her. This is the kinship care paradox. We want children to stay with family to avoid the trauma of the foster system, but that very proximity to family can be used to mask severe domestic brutality. In Jada's case, the lack of external monitoring meant that once the doors at 300 Osage Street closed, she was entirely at the mercy of two people who had no intention of being her protectors. If you believe every child deserves a safety net regardless of where they live or who they are staying with, hit the like button. It helps this story reach more people who need to be aware of the gaps that allow children like Jada to vanish in plain sight. To the residents of the 300 block of Osage Street, Clint Elwoods was the definition of a good neighbor. He was the 62-year-old man who was always visible in his yard, tending to his garden or working on his lawn. He was known for his willingness to loan out tools to anyone on the block who needed them. To the people living next door, he appeared to be a stable, helpful member of the community. He was the kind of person you wouldn't hesitate to wave to while pulling out of your driveway. But this public persona was a calculated performance. Hidden behind that neighborly exterior was a man with a documented history of violence. While his daughter back in Georgia believed he was a stand-up guy, the Illinois Department of Corrections knew a different version of Clint Elwoods. His record included convictions for robbery and carjacking, crimes that resulted in a 5-year prison sentence. These weren't minor infractions. They were indicators of a person comfortable with using force and intimidation to get what he wanted. Because Jada was placed with him informally, this violent history remained a secret to the people who mattered most. The mother who trusted him and the neighbors who lived just feet away from him. The domestic environment at the Elwoods residence was one of controlled aggression. Neighbors frequently heard Clint and his partner, 57-year-old Lisa Jones, shouting at their Rottweilers. While people might dismiss loud corrections of large dogs as normal, in this house it was a public display of the high-conflict atmosphere that defined their private lives. The aggression directed at the animals was a precursor to the violence being directed at the 5-year-old child, living inside. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the 4 months Jada spent in Park Forest was her total invisibility. Despite the fact that Clint and Lisa were frequently seen outside, the neighbors later reported a chilling fact. They had never seen a little girl at the residence. Not once. In a quiet suburban neighborhood, a child playing in the grass or walking to a car is a common sight. But Jada was kept in a state of total domestic isolation. This was not an accident. It was a deliberate tactic to ensure that the physical evidence of their discipline, the bruises and the swelling, remained hidden from the public eye. This isolation was maintained by both adults. Lisa Jones was not a passive bystander or a victim of Clint's temper. She was an active participant in the daily life of the household and, as the investigation would later prove, an active participant in the violence. When children are killed in domestic settings, there is often a dynamic where one adult encourages or reinforces the violent behavior of the other. In this house, there was no protector. There was no one for Jada to run to when things turned violent. Lisa and Clint operated as a partnership. They worked together to track Jada's failures, and they worked together to administer punishment. This wasn't a case of a single moment of snapped patience. It was a daily, collaborative effort to break a child's will. By keeping Jada away from the windows and away from the front door, they ensured that the suburban dream they presented to the neighbors remained intact, while the reality inside the home was a relentless campaign of pain. They used the privacy of their home not for comfort, but as a shield to hide the fact that a 5-year-old was being systematically destroyed. In many child abuse cases, the violence is chaotic and impulsive. But the evidence recovered from the home on Osage Street revealed something far more calculated. The primary trigger for the violence against Jada Moore was potty training. For most parents and caregivers, potty training is a developmental milestone that requires patience, encouragement, and an understanding of a child's physical limits. For Clint Elwoods and Lisa Jones, it was a battle for absolute control. They didn't see Jada's accidents as a normal part of being 5 years old, nor did they consider the stress she was under after being moved across the country. To them, every accident was an act of defiance. Every soiled piece of clothing was a personal insult that demanded a physical response. This pathological need for control was documented in a way that shocked investigators. During the search of the home, police discovered a standard wall calendar. It wasn't used for appointments or birthdays. Instead, it served as a grim ledger of Jada's offenses. On the squares of this calendar, Elwoods and Jones clinically recorded the times Jada had accidents. This punishment calendar was a written history of their escalating frustration. It turned the abuse into a scheduled event. By writing down these incidents, the perpetrators reinforced their own narrative that Jada was a problem that needed to be fixed through pain. The existence of this document proves that the violence was not a one-time loss of temper. It was premeditated, tracked, and systematic. The transition from what some might call corporal punishment to outright torture was facilitated by a specific weapon, a belt. Investigators recovered this belt at the scene, and it would become a central piece of evidence in the first-degree murder charges. When a caregiver uses their hand, there is a natural limit to the force they can apply before hurting themselves. When they reach for an implement like a belt, they are making a conscious choice to inflict a higher level of pain and damage. In the hands of Clint Elwoods, this belt was used to strike Jada across her entire body. The frequency of these beatings increased as Jada's physical and emotional state likely deteriorated. There is a tragic feedback loop that occurs in these types of cases. As Jada was beaten for having accidents, the trauma and fear would have made it even harder for her to control her bodily functions. This led to more offenses on the calendar, which in turn led to more severe beatings with the belt. What began as a misguided attempt at discipline quickly evolved into a campaign of physical torture. The perpetrators weren't trying to teach Jada, they were trying to break her. They treated a 5-year-old child like a soldier who failed to follow orders, applying a military-style discipline to a toddler who simply needed a bathroom. The physical evidence of the belt and the written evidence of the calendar strip away any defense of accidental death. You don't keep a log of accidents and a weapon on. Stand by if you aren't planning the violence. Every mark on that calendar was a missed opportunity for mercy. Every strike of that belt was a step toward the fatal trauma that would eventually occur on July 14th. This was a house governed by a rigid, violent logic where a 5-year-old girl was punished for the crime of being a child. We're halfway through this forensic breakdown. If you find these deep insights into the criminal mind valuable for understanding the reality of these cases, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a Crimelens file. Your engagement helps us continue to shine a light on the stories that the system often overlooks. The report from the Cook County Medical Examiner's Office provides a clinical, indisputable record of what Jada Moore endured during her 4 months in Illinois. When a child dies under suspicious circumstances, the body becomes the primary witness. In this case, Jada's body told a story of a sustained long-term assault. The autopsy revealed multiple injuries across her head, torso, and extremities. These were not the typical scrapes or bruises of an active 5-year-old. They were the forensic markers of a victim. A critical part of this forensic reality is the timeline of the injuries. The medical examiner found bruises, abrasions, and scars in various stages of healing. In forensic pathology, the color of a bruise indicates its age. A fresh injury is typically deep purple or blue, representing recent blunt force trauma where blood has just pooled under the skin. As the body begins to break down that blood, the bruise shifts to a greenish-yellow hue. Jada had both. This combination of old and new trauma is the medical proof of chronic abuse. It confirms that the violence didn't just happen on the night she died. It had been a systematic part of her life since at least April 2023. She was living in a constant state of physical recovery, only to be struck again before the previous wounds could close. While the chronic abuse had weakened Jada's small frame, the terminal cause of death was an acute, catastrophic brain injury. The autopsy identified a subdural hematoma. To understand this in raw terms, the brain is a soft organ protected by a hard skull and a series of tough outer membranes. A subdural hematoma occurs when blunt force trauma, such as a heavy strike to the head or violent shaking, causes the blood vessels between the brain and its outermost covering to tear. When these vessels rupture, blood begins to leak out and collect in the space around the brain. Because the skull is rigid, there is nowhere for this blood to go. It creates massive, mounting pressure on the brain tissue itself. As the pressure increases, it shifts the brain off-center and begins to crush the areas responsible for basic life functions, like breathing and heart rate. For a 5-year-old whose skull and brain are still developing, this process is rapid and lethal. Jada didn't just fall, asleep. Her brain was physically shutting down due to the force of the final assault delivered on July 14th. The final hours of Jada's life were spent in a desperate, high-stakes medical intervention. After the 911 call, paramedics found her unresponsive and immediately began CPR on the living room floor. She was rushed to Franciscan Health in Olympia Fields, but her condition was so critical that doctors ordered an emergency airlift to Comer Children's Hospital in Chicago. This is a facility built for the most severe pediatric traumas, equipped with the best technology and specialists available. Despite the flight, the ventilators, and the efforts of the trauma team, the damage was too deep. The pressure from the hematoma had already caused irreversible neurological collapse. At approximately 9 a.m. on Saturday, July 15th, the medical staff officially pronounced her dead. The girl who loved Pink and Barbie was gone, leaving behind only the forensic evidence of a 4-month campaign of torture that the system failed to see until it was too late. The legal consequences for the death of Jada Moore were swift. Both Clint Elwoods and Lisa Jones were charged with first-degree murder. In many cases, a defense might argue about who delivered the final, fatal strike to the head. However, the prosecution is moving forward on the accountability theory. Under this legal framework, it does not matter whose hand held the belt or who caused the final hematoma. Because both adults participated in the months of physical torture and both failed to seek medical help while the child was dying on their couch, they are equally responsible. In the eyes of the law, a partner who watches a child be destroyed is just as guilty as the one doing the hitting. They both face a potential life sentence without the possibility of parole. This case exposes a lethal safety gap in our child welfare framework. The Illinois Department of Children and Family Services stated they had no prior contact with the family. This is the flaw in the system. Because Jada was moved privately across state lines, no background checks were performed on Clint Elwoods. If a formal system had been involved, his history of robbery and carjacking would have surfaced immediately. Jada fell through a hole in the law where family is assumed to be safe, but oversight is viewed as an intrusion. The community of Park Forest, which never knew Jada was alive, rallied to honor her in death. They organized vigils filled with pink balloons and Barbie-themed memorials. Local residents donated funds to ensure she was buried in a custom-made Barbie dress, the very thing she loved in Georgia before she was brought to Illinois. This act of collective grief was a way for the neighborhood to apologize for not seeing the invisible child on their own block. For Kimberly Elwoods, the trauma is a double betrayal. She lost her daughter and discovered that her father, the man she called a stand-up guy, was a predator. Her story is a warning that economic desperation can force parents into making trust-based decisions that have no safety net. The life lesson here is about the danger of domestic isolation. If you live in a neighborhood where you see adults but never the children who are supposed to live there, or if you hear constant aggression behind closed doors, do not assume everything is fine. Isolation is the abuser's most powerful tool. The invisible children in our communities rely on the eyes and ears of neighbors to break the cycle of violence. Jada's story is a reminder that silence is the abuser's best friend. Sharing this video isn't just about views, it's about raising awareness of the gaps in kinship care safety that allow children to disappear. If you've followed this investigation to the end, comment "Justice for Jada" below. Your engagement ensures these stories aren't buried alongside the victims. Thanks for watching. See you in the next episode of Crimelens Files.